how's it going? I'm Anali Jamal, and today I want to talk to you about some tips and tricks that I like to use when I'm using a melody and trying to figure out what chords to play on top. So basically trying to accompany yourself. Now I'll be sharing some tips and tricks that I like to use in my own compositions. And the song that we're going to be working on here today is actually one of my own songs that I just wrote specifically for this lesson. So before we dive into the actual exercises, I just want to make sure that you have the tabs downloaded in the description below. So make sure you check that. You can pause the video and grab that before we continue. Okay, so now first things first, let's talk about the scale that we're going to be in this whole song. Now we're going to be in the key of B minor. And if you don't know the scale, it goes like this. It's on the A string starting on the 2nd fret, 2, 4, 5, 2, 4, 5, 2, 4, 2, 3, 5, 2, 3, 5. Okay, so this is the key of B minor, and most of the notes that we're going to pick in all of the examples that are going to follow are going to be more or less used with these notes in mind. So now at this point, what I like to do and kind of my thought process as to how I write melodies is I might just even play the 2nd fret there on the A string while I play the scale descending. So I might choose to go with the highest note, maybe the pinky finger on the 5th fret of the E string, and go backwards. For every 2 notes that I play though, I'm going to play one time with the bass note like this. So if that's a little bit difficult for you to do, I would just say practice that a few more times until you get it, because this sort of technique here, keeping that bass line on kind of constantly autopilot as we are doing some melodic lines underneath it, that is essentially the building blocks to playing fingerstyle, right? Obviously, one other thing you can do is you can just do a bar chord here with the index finger and play everything around that. That does make it more difficult, like this. Alright, so now let's talk about the 4 exercises that I have come up with to give you the idea of how we can take a very simple bass line and write melodies on top. So this is kind of my thought process. Right now I'm thinking, let's play a really simple bass line by just a descending bass line starting with the 2nd fret on the A string, open A, then to the G on the 3rd fret of the low E string, and then on the 2 on the F sharp there on the low E string. Okay, so we basically just have this. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, but what I like to do is I like to have the bass line pretty simple to start with. That way, when I'm thinking about different melodic ideas, I can kind of work on the melody being a little bit more complex and having the bass line be a little bit more simple. So it's very important to think about when you're writing your own music or discovering or just improvising things like this, is try to make one thing very simple and set yourself up for success. Now this leads me to example 1, which what I would call here is the beginner level of this specific example. So let me play it for you once and I'll explain what I'm doing here. Okay, so as you can see, the bass line is being played 4 times every bar. Right, so that's kind of the reoccurring pattern that we have here. So the way I usually like to start my exercises is start slow and easy and then build up into more complex playing. And this idea will get a lot more complex. But I just want to show you the building blocks to how I write a melody. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. And why is it that I'm choosing this note here, the 3rd fret of the B string, rather than any other note with the bass line? It's because this note here, if I make this an octave lower, it actually is the minor 3rd of this note. So it sounds really good. That's actually why I'm picking this. And oftentimes what I'll do is I'll pick a note that is in the harmony of the chord. In this case, that being the 3rd interval, the minor 3rd, I know it's going to sound good with this on top. Okay? This will eventually lead into the next part, which is that melody. Right, so it's a very simple melody here. So what's happening is that we almost have a melody or a phrase of the melody played between 2 different chords. chords between the B minor chord and then the A chord. So think about that when you're writing your own music as well, that sometimes the phrase of a melody does not need to end within just the first chord. In this case, I chose 2 different chords before the melody stops. So let me play that again, just the first 2 bars. Okay, that's very effective because of that open A. It creates the illusion now that I'm playing an A chord underneath. All right, so this is kind of the building blocks of getting that bass line and that melody to work together, to really harmonize nicely. So now let's look at bar 3 and 4 of example 1 to play that low G here on the 3rd fret of the E string, low E string here. Now I'm going to use the 4 on the G string. Then I'm going to move that over here to the 2nd frets. And now, notice there we're actually doing a little bit of a modulation. I'm actually going into an F sharp major chord. Now the F sharp major chord isn't actually a part of the B minor scale, but it is what we could call maybe an accidental chord here, all right? And it creates a very nice chromatic line to the B note here if we were to repeat it, right? So that's why that works as well. So we're playing F sharp with the A here, to the A sharp, and then to the B, because it resolves back to the B. So think about that as well. If we ever want to loop something, this is one approach that you could do. I use this quite a bit. And so this chromatic step, meaning that there's only a half step between, or 1 fret in between each note, creates this sort of movement, almost a progression into the whole looping cycle of it. Okay, so one other thing I want to point out with this example is that there's actually a little bit of a musical sequence going on. Now this is such an important and powerful tool that I like to use all throughout my playing. And what that means, a musical sequence, is when you take a melody like this and you basically play the exact same thing down 1 interval. So let me explain what that means. So if I'm playing this, that melody, and I want to play the exact same thing with the same rhythmic pattern but down 1 interval, I can keep going. So you see, this is a musical sequence. So we're taking the same melody and kind of moving it down 1 interval here in the key of B minor. Okay, this is a very effective tool. I was first introduced to this from my dad playing violin, and because he plays Persian violin. And growing up listening to that stuff was so haunting, and it was such a simple melody. But obviously he would throw in these little grace notes and things like that that makes, you know, Persian music so nostalgic and so kind of just hits you right in the heart. And it creates this illusion that there's this kind of constantly moving melodic line going down. Right? So it's a very common thing, and our ears typically are very comfortable with listening to it and almost are expecting it at some times, right? Okay, so notice I did that in the first bar there, the first melody. So in the 3rd bar, we're actually playing a very similar sequence down here with the G. So almost like us doing a sort of the 1st bar and the 3rd bar have the same sort of rhythmic pattern. This creates an illusion almost like we have a tie between different bars in the song. Even though this is a 4-bar progression that I'm just doing here, we already have this connection between bar 1 and bar 3 by this musical sequence that kind of ties it in together. Very important. I use this all throughout my music as well. All right, so let's have a look at example 2 now. Okay, so now we're taking what we learned from the first example and just beefing it up a little bit by adding some more harmonic notes, okay? Now we're starting to get into this idea that we have the background, middle ground, and foreground. This is exactly the same way that a painter might think of a landscape painting, right? The foreground being the melody, could be the house in front, or that person in front of the farm. That's the first thing that you see when you look at a landscape painting. Then you've got the middle ground, which could be the harmonic notes, the harmony notes that emphasizes the melody. And that in the landscape painting could be equal to kind of the plains, the forest that's right in the middle between the foreground and the background. And of course, then the bass line could be equivalent to the background. It's just there to kind of complement everything else, to kind of put it all into perspective and put it all together. So here we're still playing the same progression. We're still playing the B, A, G, F sharp with the bass line, but we're just doing more things now melodically. So what I'm doing here, I'm now playing to choose this complete kind of third interval here, and here we have the 5. This is basically the minor 3 and then the 5 of the B. That's why this works. Okay, so now I'm playing. So now what I'm going to do is going to take the middle finger there on the 2nd fret of the G string and then the pinky finger on 4th fret to create another sort of B minor 7 shape, right? So now we have, and now middle finger is going to slide to 4, index finger on 3, and now I'm going to play them together with the open A because this is the introduction now to the 2nd bar. Now this chord right here, it's very nice because this is just emphasizing the A chord. It's this A shape here. Okay, just another way of playing, another inversion basically of playing it. Okay, so now we have pinky finger, ring finger on 7, and from here I'm actually going to use this as a leading note to get me into the next part, which is over here on the 2s, the 2nd fret. Okay, now notice that again we are using some notes as a kind of a passing note. We're not choosing to land on them because they don't harmonically really make sense. I mean, if I were to play these notes with the open A and stay on it, you could do that, definitely, but I'm looking to resolve this sort of idea into the A, back into the A chord here. Then I'm going to use that with the F sharp here for one time, then back to the open A. Okay, so already with these first 2 bars, we have something pretty much way more melodic, I would say, than the first example. Now you might be wondering, why am I choosing to go up the fretboard at this point? Because here's the thing, I'm trying to explore as many ideas as I can. Okay, so this is just my thought process on how I'm exploring and choosing to land on different notes. But notice as well, I'm constantly choosing to play the bass line always on the downbeat, on beat 1, 2, 3, and 4. No syncopation just yet. Okay, now after this F sharp here back to the A, we're going to go into this shape here, which is a G major 7. And again, notice that that bass line is still there. Now, if you're not comfortable using your thumb, perfectly fine. You can use your middle finger. If you're thinking about, sequentially, how can you go into this? I'd use my middle finger here, then the other fingers around it. Now, as I'm doing this, notice I'm going to lift only the fingers that I need to play the second one, the second beat. Then pinky finger is going to go to 5, and then ring finger back to 3 together. But again, notice that bass line is always there. Or you could play it with the thumb. So now we're going to go back into the F sharp minor chord here, then to the F sharp major chord. Okay, so now if I were to play example 1 and example 2 back to back, it would sound like this. Alright, so as you can see, basically, if you've got a simple bass line, a descending bass line like I just presented to you here, think about how many different ideas you can come up with for yourself. This is just one variation. Now, I came up with all of these ideas in about an hour or two of just exploring a lot of different ideas. And it's such a joy because this is all stuff that I had never written before prior to this exact lesson. So these spread triads really can play a big role, as well as knowing the scale, of course, and kind of following the rules of what notes would potentially sound good over what chord. And so with that, I find that when you combine these sort of spread triad voicings with sequential playing, by keeping the bass line active the whole time, that's really the building blocks to creating a melody with some chords to accompany yourself. And obviously knowing theory can actually really be a very beneficial tool to help you get to the results that you want to much quicker. Alright, hopefully you enjoyed this lesson with me here today. If you did, make sure you hit the like and the subscribe button below if you aren't following already. It would mean a lot to me and it would really help the channel grow as well. Also, a big thanks to all the patrons who've helped support me in making this video a possibility. They actually voted on this specific topic over at my Patreon page. If you are interested in becoming a patron yourself, I do have that link in the description below for exclusive content as well as voting power on what lessons I teach next. Thanks again, and see you in the next lesson.